First of all, a big thank you to organizers for giving me this opportunity. As you heard, my name is Paulius Kunčinas. I'm the chief economist. I work for a asset management company, and our traditional historical focus has been on renewables and alternative energy. So we are specialists in energy transition. So agriculture has been somewhat at a distance from us, but we've always been very interested in the opportunities and have been investing in agriculture, specifically in grain sector. And I'm very excited actually, because normally I get asked to speak about industries, I get to speak about transportation, and this is one of the rare occasions when I can talk about agriculture, which I actually think is one of the most important sectors and sadly overlooked by capital markets. Main reason is that most of the finance sector find it difficult to understand the risks. And actually, I think the Green Deal could be the game changer and could make this sector more investable, more attractive for the finance sector. So in my presentation, I'll try to approach this topic from the point of view of investors, of financial risk managers, and talk about short-term and then medium-term opportunities, and of course, what are the potential risks to the sector. So let's just quickly establish the big picture. So we know that European agriculture sector has historically produced between 1 to 5% of so-called gross value add. On average, I'm told the contribution to GDP is around 1.5%. So it has declined in importance as a sector, but it is still very important politically because it occupies a large percentage of the labor force. And of course, it secures, it's the fundamental source of food and food security, which has become a big political issue, especially now that we face inflationary pressures. Also, it's worth noting that agriculture is not a major contributor to CO2 emission. It's estimated it contributes around 10%. So that's a small part compared to the big emitters, such as utilities, coal-fired power plants, transportation sector, or indeed the big industrial players. So it hasn't really received a big attention the way that other sectors. It's sort of been overlooked in that sense. However, when we talk about Green Deal, and there's a lot of different goals that have been set by the Green Deal, reducing chemical pesticides by 50%, 25% organic farming, antimicrobials, nutrient losses. I would still argue in the very short term, the only thing that really matters is how much agriculture can contribute to CO2 emission reduction. This is the goal of the next 5 years. And this is the rationale, the political rationale of the Green Deal is climate change. So that's the priority, and I think the success or failure will depend on whether agriculture sector can tap into opportunities that are created by this overarching goal. And I think, to be fair, opportunities are obvious and very many, and there's a lot that we can do immediately, and this is where I hope the capital markets can engage. So the obvious areas that I'm sure have been mentioned many times that we get excited by is digitalization. So this is the overall aim of the Green Deal, is to transform businesses, industries, everything into digital in order to enable, first of all, enable new technologies such as automation. So as a result, we're moving to more less labor intensive sector, hopefully more energy efficient. Now, the big topic, especially this year and next year, will be electrification of mobility. Now, I have to say that I think the potential, the immediate potential of electrification in the agriculture sector is limited. I think it will be a while before we see electrical tractors, electrical machinery. But will come as batteries become more efficient. So it's more of a 3 to 5 year perspective. Now, I think the most exciting opportunity, and I will talk about it a little bit later, is the synergy between renewables, i.e. the solar and wind, and agriculture. I think this is where the biggest convergence, as it were, as I think the nature of agriculture, it will change, and agriculture will take advantage of its biggest asset that it has, which is land, access to land, which we know has been a traditional problem, as we have a problem of scarcity. We do not have enough land for renewable sector in Europe. And that's why it's the main reason why renewables make up only 10% of the EU's overall power capacity, and very difficult to grow it if we don't have access to land. So this is where agriculture will play a key role. And of course, agriculture also plays a big part in energy efficiency. So as we need to move from more sort of energy intensive to more energy efficient technologies, savings. Of course, in the northern part of Europe, there's a big focus on building efficiency and building renovations. And I already mentioned digitalization. And of course, the most exciting opportunity, which is actually dictated not from regulators, not from politicians, but from the market, is that people now demanding healthier, more quality food. And this eco farming is really coming up. We can see it in our supermarkets as sections for ecological food is expanding. And I think here's, in particular, I want to mention that Lithuania has a slight competitive advantage because we are one of the least, let's say, carbonized, fertilizer-intensive agri-sectors in Europe. Now, let's just quickly go back to what it was all about, the Green Deal. So as you know, there were 4 different directions. There was the renewables, which is probably the biggest winner from this new movement. The second one, which I mentioned is very important, is renovations, actually saving energy. And this involves a lot of investment into buildings. Then e-mobility, that's the hottest development right now. We see it, we think that in 22, we will see a big jump in electrical fast charging infrastructure. And then finally, of course, which is where most relevant for it's just for agriculture, is sustainable economy, which is, I think, the most overlooked at the moment. It's somehow a priority for the 23 rather than 22, but I think a lot of regulatory work is already started, and we will see a lot of new directives in next year. Now, I'm a firm believer that the most exciting area is actually alternative energy, renewables. So that specifically for us means solar and onshore and offshore wind. We are talking about hydrogen as well. There's a lot of interesting developments, but I think hydrogen is 5 to 7 years out. The technology is not quite there yet. But I think in the renewables, in the solar sector in particular, this is where agriculture can play a big role. And specifically, I want to mention new developments of combining agriculture and solar. So there are already a few examples of basically using the land for dual purposes. It can be used for animal grazing, for sheep farming, for fish farming, for different kinds of agricultural products. There are new technologies available to basically enable production of electricity from solar whilst using the land for agriculture. I think the biggest challenge there is storage, because in most cases, agriculture sector does not need that amount of energy for self-usage. So what we need to solve is how we store this energy. And I think the next 24 months, in fact, we will have the new battery technology, so we will be able to store it. And so this will create a very exciting new opportunity for agriculture to combine renewables with traditional agriculture. So of course, I have to mention the financing. I think that's the big elephant in the room. We all know that the European Commission, the European leaders came up with a very ambitious financing plan, which is called the Resilience Recovery Fund, the RRF. It's designed partly to stimulate our economies as we exit the COVID crisis, which we hope we will be able to do by the first quarter of 22. But it combines the other ambition, the bigger structural ambition to transform the European economy into green, sustainable, and of course, address the CO2, the climate change goals. Decarbonization in one word. So there's quite a lot of funding available. I'm not going to go into details. Sadly, I have to say that again, agriculture is not the priority. I think the biggest winners will be industrial players, but I think it creates a lot of new funding opportunities, primarily as the finance sector is going green. So what's really exciting, and I think maybe overlooked, that for the last 5 years, before even politicians started talking about it, the finance sector has already been adopting green standards. So for many, many years, we had people pretending to be green. We had this phenomenon called greenwashing. Now, I think as of last 3 years, the industry has become quite serious, and there are new standards be created. We know them, they call it taxonomy here in Brussels. It's basically, essentially a guidebook on criteria, what's green, not green. It's being finalized by the Commission and European Parliament. We already know broadly what it will say. And as of next year, it hopefully becomes binding. And the good news is that the European Central Bank seems to be very serious and has introduced a number of requirements for the financing sector and specifically for banks to include taxonomy, i.e. to basically introduce a green audit so that every investor, every bank actually has to disclose what is their carbon footprint. And that essentially creates a requirement also for clients to disclose and track their basically carbon intensity. This is both a challenge, but also, I would argue, a big opportunity, because as a result, there will be a lot of financing and capital available for companies that actually are investing in new green technologies. So what's going to be new? We will have a green audit that will basically, every company will have to disclose how much of their revenue, profit, and capex is invested in green projects. By now, we know for a fact that coal is excluded. There's, as you know, very big debate at the moment whether nuclear and gas will be declared green. I see that there will be actually three categories. There will be green, yellow, and red. So coal will be in the red category. I think nuclear and gas will end up in the yellow, i.e. transitional category. And then wind, solar, hydro, and renewables, in other words, and hydrogen will be in the green category. So this will give us clear indications, and basically every company will then do an audit and will be able to, as a result, have probably easier access to capital. So now let's come to the risks, of which there are a few. So in very short term, 22 is going to be a challenging year for everyone, including the agri sector. I think the biggest pressure is, of course, inflation. We have the biggest disruption in supply chains that I can recall in my adult life, maybe since last time in the 90s. We have inflation running above 5% in Germany, which is unheard of, and possibly going to 6-7% in the US. And of course, emerging market inflation is very high. So that's not a good time to engage in big restructuring. So it is green transformation is coming at a difficult time, including for agriculture sector. So I think actually a lot of people will delay their decisions on making big investment decisions, buying new technology, and that's of course creates a gap. The money is available. The politicians are telling us we need to get going and reduce the CO2, but actually we probably better off waiting until prices stabilize, until we have better predictability of what's going on. Now, the other source of, I think, risk is that actually the politicians are very sensitive to price increases, especially in food. We saw that during the Asian food crisis, which I witnessed firsthand. It can cause huge social unrest. And of course, what politicians do, they put pressure on producers, suppliers, not to increase prices. And that, of course, has a negative effect for their margins and profitability. So that's something we will need to address. Luckily, I have to say that the fiscal environment is very favorable. Now we just had yesterday the German coalition was confirmed, and we have social democrats in power who favor a process of adjustment, i.e. that when nobody is insisting on balanced budgets. So the governments have a lot of room to help sectors such as agriculture to transition and maybe absorb some of the price increase, and of course help the households, the vulnerable households who are exposed to price increases, which hopefully takes off the pressure of the politicians. Meanwhile, one of the key risks that we identify, of course, is the increase in oil and other prices, commodity price increase. Especially, I think the 22 is going to be a difficult year for fertilizer industry. We already saw huge rises in the price of potash, urea, ammonia. The entire complex is under a lot of pressure. And there's, of course, the geopolitical dimension. As you know, for instance, Belarus is one of the biggest exporters in potash, and there are sanctions. So the market is really disrupted. So ironically, that perhaps will incentivize the farmers to use less of fertilizer and to seek technologies, including digitalization, to make use of fertilizer more efficiently. At the same time, you have the challenge in the labor force. So that's a universal phenomenon. We're experiencing what's called the Great Resignation. A lot of people do not want to go back to contact industry work. As I heard previous speaker at this forum also mentioned that agriculture has suffered historically from especially younger people not finding attractive enough. So how are you going to incentivize people to go back to work in agriculture? It's a really big issue, not faced just by Europe, but also United States and other countries. I think the answer, as you know, as we all know, is automation, whether we like it or not. We're simply going to reduce the number of workforce through robotization, from self-driving vehicles to simply making the whole process more efficient and achieving higher yields from the same hectare through technology. I think that's the only answer at the moment. And I think that's on the positive side, that we should incentivize farmers to invest in new technology. Now, the big unknown that we're all witnessing is simply the climate change. So climate change is definitely having a big impact on agriculture. We are seeing some very strange weather patterns, very hot summers, very cold winters. Seasons seem to have shifted. So that's creating uncertainty for farmers, also the entire food industry, and that's adding to risk. That's why I'm saying my conclusion is it's very hard for investors to know what is the return on investment, the long-term investment on this industry. We are told, and we believe it's a very exciting. There's a lot of a return available for the risk takers, but it requires a lot of knowledge, expertise, and a healthy risk appetite. So I think what we will initially see is that agriculture sector will have to rely on a lot of debt, especially debt that is backed by sovereigns, i.e. credit lines, special credit lines for agriculture. And then I think equity will be available, but to probably larger players who move into more integrated plays. So agriculture with renewables, agriculture with services, logistics, where they have a more diversified revenue stream and they de-risk themselves. So the conclusion from that is that size will matter. I think the trend will continue that, bigger farmers, corporate with a corporate approach, will have better access to capital and technology. So I mentioned already inflation, and one of the sources is CO2 charge. So we think that that's another source of inflation in 22 through fuel. I think the biggest challenge for all of European industries, including agriculture, is competitiveness. We know that the rest of the world, including our neighbors in be it in Russia, in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, also in Asia, Latin America, they're not subject to the same rigorous standards. And
I would kindly ask maybe to come to the conclusion part, sure, if you can, because we have to leave some room for the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I think overall, I'm an optimist. I think this sector is very exciting. I think that the main game changer is the resources. I think technology is available. I think we will need to get through 22. I think this will become investable in 23. The main source of support and hope and de-risk is fiscal politics, and the fact that capital is still relatively cheap, and people and companies and agri companies that make transition with green credentials have access to new markets. On that note, I conclude and thank you for your attention.